Shalom, everybody, and welcome to Youth for Torah, where we dig deep into Elohim's word to know more about him. Please forgive me the delay of the upload of this video, but let's go ahead and get started. So this is our second weekly Torah portion, Parashah number 2, titled Noach, because it will tell us the story of a certain biblical figure who we know by the name of Noah, but the correct pronunciation of his name is Noach. So let's get started. All right, going a few steps back into our previous Torah portion, we saw how in the name of the first 10 generations of the Bible is the plan of salvation. And we can see that as follows. From Adam to Noach, the message is, man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down teaching. His death shall bring or brings the despairing rest or despairing comfort. Now, what's interesting is that this part matches with our Haftarah in Yeshayahu 53 from 4 to 12 that says the following. It is quite a long set of verses, so I highlighted the ones that I believe that are linked to the previous message. That here it talks about the suffering servant, which portrays the coming of the first coming of the Messiah, the Mashiach, that is Yeshua. So it says, it was our diseases he bore, our pains from which he suffered. We were appointed mortal sorrow, but he was the one that bore our diseases and our pains. Because of our crimes, crushed because of our sins. Again, yet Adonai laid on him the guilt of all of us. Like a lamb led to be slaughtered after forcible arrest and sentencing, his being cut off from the land of the living for the crimes of my people. That means that he got killed. So that's why is his death shall bring the despairing comfort, because he had to die. And of course, in the end, he is rewarded for his sacrifice. Therefore, I will assign him a share with the great. He will divide the spoil with the mighty for having exposed himself to death and being counted among the sinners, while actually bearing the sin of many and interceding for the offenders. So this again shows how since the beginning, God had a special plan to rescue humanity through the death of his one and only son, Yeshua HaMashiach. Okay, then we see that in Genesis 6:3, again, we are still in the previous Torah portion to see a few highlights before we go into this new one, that God gives man a lifespan, because we saw how the first 10 generations of the Bible lived more than 500 years. Some lived 900, some lived 700. So, and since evil was increasing in the earth, God reduces the lifespan of the mankind to a maximum limit of 120 years. And we see that in Genesis 6:5, it said that mankind only had evil in their hearts. Now, in Hebrew literature, when we study the Bible, there is not a word for brain. And most of the Hebrew writers uses the word heart, lev. Now, the heart is linked to many areas in a human being's life, such as the intellectual part of a person, the emotional part of the person, the rational part of the person, and the spiritual part of the person. Everything that commands a person's life. Therefore, if only evil is in what commands your life, that is terrible, because that means that your thoughts are evil, your actions are evil, your constant intent is evil. So that was the condition of the world. Therefore, God, and we see in verses from 7 through 8, has the plan to destroy the world, but spared Noah. And we see that this condition that the world was in that time of constant evil is nothing new and will be repeated, or is being repeated, better said, nowadays. If we see in Matthew 24 from 36 to 39, we see, but when that day and hour will come, no one knows. Not the angels in heaven, not the Son, only the Father. For the Son of Man's coming will be just as it was in the days of Noah. So this means that the condition of the world is going to be of increased evil. So, and if we analyze how our world is nowadays, we can see that the world's condition is truly evil. Back then, before the flood, people went on eating and drinking, taking wives and becoming wives, right up till the day Noach entered the ark. And they didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. It will be just like that when the Son of Man comes, which is true now. Nowadays, everybody is like in this perpetual sleep. But there are few who are having this spiritual revival or awakening and returning back to the roots that they have, their Hebrew roots, the roots of Torah. But not all are doing so. Most of the world, like a huge percentage of the world, is still eating and drinking, marrying and not marrying. But in this sense, is that what it means is that they are living they're just like their regular lives, but not paying attention to the condition that surrounds them and how the world is little by little coming closer and closer to the end, and how we now have to have a revival in order for us not to be surprised when the end comes. And if I dare say, we are in the end days. We also see this in Luke 17, verses 26 and 27. Also at that time of the Son of Man, it will be just as it was at the time of Noach. People ate and drank, and men and women married right up until the day Noach entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. Okay, and then we see how our generation today, how do we know that this generation is like the generation of Noah? Well, let's see what Proverbs has to say. Proverbs 30, 11 to 14, it says, there is a generation that curses its father and does not bless its mother. There is a generation that is pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness. There is a generation, oh, how haughty are their eyes, or prideful, and their eyelids are lifted up. There's a generation whose teeth are like swords and whose fangs are like knives to devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. This sounds a lot like our generation. We see how constantly there is this increase of crimes against parents against their children. We see that people think that what they do is right. There's nothing wrong. There's no definition of good and evil, because that's how the world is putting it, but that's not what Bible says, and it is not washed from its filthiness. And we see how pride is the main source of it all. And of course, nobody has pity on the poor. Well, of course, better said, none of the evil people have pity on the poor. And as we see from verses 7 through 8 in Genesis 6, Adonai said, I will wipe out humankind whom I have created from the whole earth, and not only human beings, but animals, creeping things, and birds in the air, for I regret that I ever made them. But Noach found grace in the sight of Adonai. We really need to be careful with how we live, because we can't have this selfish way of being. And imagine hurting or breaking the heart of the Most High God to the point of even making him so very sad. Like, to think of that is just inconceivable. But to the point that they made him get sad in this point of history is truly heartbreaking. So now we have to analyze if in our lives we are doing things that are making God sad or not. And we see in 2 Kepha 2:5, 2 Peter 2:5, it says, and he did not spare the ancient world. On the contrary, he preserved Noach, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, and brought the flood upon the world of ungodly people. Again, who were the ones that died? The ungodly people, and only 8 people were saved on account of Noach's righteousness. So here we have a definition of righteous versus a definition of ungodly. On what area are you located? Are you part of the righteous, or are you part of the ungodly? For the righteous, we have some examples that the Bible gives us. Let's go to Yaakov 1:22-37, that says, "Don't deceive yourselves by only hearing what the word says, but do it. For whoever hears the word but doesn't do what it says, is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror, who looks at himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what he looks like. But if a person looks closely into the perfect Torah, which gives freedom and continues, becoming not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work it requires, then he will be blessed in what he does. Anyone who thinks he is religiously observant but does not control his tongue is deceiving himself, and his observance counts for nothing. The religious observance that God the Father considers pure and faultless is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being contaminated by the world." So here we see many important aspects in what a righteous person should do. First of all, not only to listen to Torah or listen to your Bible, the whole Bible, but you need to do. That means that you need to obey what God has ordained in the Bible, in the Torah, to be exact. That is, of course, the law. And it also says that we need to control our tongue, because, of course, with our tongue, we can kill and also we can bring life. And it also talks about the importance of taking care of those that don't have who to take care of them, being orphans and widows, and that is also in Torah. And to keep oneself from being contaminated by the world. What does that mean? To not be of the world. And Yeshua talks about this, to not be of the world, because those who are of the world are not of the Father. Therefore, and what does it mean to be about the world? Just to be Torah breakers. In other words, to do lawlessness or to do things that go against what God asks you to do. What other verse do we have for righteous versus righteousness? We have Ephesians. I'm sorry, I forgot the E right there. Ephesians 5:1-9. It says, "So imitate God as his dear children, and live a life of love, just as also the Messiah loved us. Indeed, on our behalf gave himself up as an offering, as a slaughtered sacrifice to God with a pleasing fragrance." This is important because later on, if you read Revelation, it says that there was, like, the people were obedient, but they forgot about their first love. So obedience is not just to do it because you have to do it, but do it because you love God. It says, "Among you there should not even be mentioned sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or greed. These are utterly inappropriate for God's holy people. Also, out of place are obscenity and stupid talk and coarse language." This is important because many times, again, society is the one that can infect you, if you can use that word, can infect you with different types of customs that are anti-biblical. And one of these is bad talk. It could be obscene speech. It could be nonsensical speech. As it says here, stupid talk, and even coarse language. In other words, bad words. So sometimes, because of, like, it's well, the whole world says it, why not? I mean, like, it's just a word. No, it's not just a word, because if you are to represent God's holy people, holy meaning kadosh, meaning set apart, you cannot do something that goes against what God is. And God does not speak coarse language. He does not speak bad words, not once. So we ought to keep our tongues of talking, not only like gossiping and slander. We have to keep that out of our mouths, but also we have to eliminate any kind of obscene and coarse vocabulary. Continue on, it says, instead, you should be giving thanks. Again, our tongues should be used for praise, worship, and thanks to our God and to bless other people. For of this you can be sure, every sexually immoral, impure, or greedy person, that is, every idol worshiper, has no share in the kingdom of the Messiah and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty talk, for it is because of these things that God's judgment is coming on those who disobey him. Again, who's God's judgment coming? On those who disobey him. So don't become partners with them, for you used to be darkness, but now, united with the Lord, you are light. And remember, what is light? Light is Torah, because that is Yeshua's light. Live like children of light, for the fruit of the light is in every kind of goodness, rightness, and truth. Now, if we look at the counterpart, that is the ungodly, what are the characteristics of an ungodly person? Let's check out Psalms 73, 8 through 11. It says, they scoff and speak with malice. They loftily utter threats. Again, they sin with their mouths. They set their mouths against heaven. Their tongues swagger through the earth. So they not only speak against heaven, but they also use their tongues incorrectly on earth. Therefore, his people return here and thoughtlessly suck up that whole cup of water. Then they ask, how does God know? Does the Most High really have knowledge? They even defy the Lord. So it's this state of defiance toward the Lord. And then we have 1 Timothy 1, 8 through 11. We know that Torah is good, provided one uses it in the way the Torah itself intends. There it says it, Torah is good, and it has to be used in the way Torah itself intends. We are aware that Torah is not for a person who is righteous. Pay attention that this does not mean that Torah is abolished. This means that a person who is righteous is already a fulfiller of Torah. This person knows Torah by heart. That's why it says Torah is not for a person who is righteous. But it says, but for those who are heedless of Torah and rebellious, ungodly and sinful. In other words, those who don't do Torah are sinful and ungodly people, wicked and worldly, for people who kill their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, both heterosexual and homosexual, slave dealers, liars, perjurers, and anyone who acts contrary to the sound teaching. What sound teaching? Yeshua's teaching. What did Yeshua teach? Torah. That accords with the good news of the glorious and blessed God. So once again, we have righteous is a Torah-full person. Ungodly, Torah-less person. Very well. So, in order to destroy the whole world, but to save Noach and his family, God orders Noach to build an ark. So, God tells Noach about certain materials that he is to use in order to build this ark. One is gopher wood, and the other one is pitch to cover it from the outside and in the inside. So here we see gopher wood and pitch. Now, question, what is gopher wood? The following information that I'm about to share with you is from a website that I am leaving the link right there, as you can see. But I found it quite interesting because gopher itself does not have a translation. We do not know exactly what gopher wood is in the sense of like what type of tree. Some Bibles translate it as cypress, but other Bibles leave it wisely untranslated. So that should be just left like that, gopher wood, because we do not know exactly what kind of wood it is. But if we try to investigate a little bit more and we look deeper at the Hebrew part of this, gopher is used as the root word for gofrit, and gofrit means brimstone. This word is used 7 times in the Tanakh and in the context of God's fiery judgment on human wickedness. So again, we are in a moment where God is judging the world and about to destroy the whole world. And the only times where brimstone is used is in the context of God's fiery judgment on human wickedness. And the Greek form for gofrit is theon. So this theon is also mentioned 7 times in the Brit Hadashah, also in the context of God's judgment. So this is quite interesting. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's mentioned 7 times, both in the Tanakh and in the Brit Hadashah. We know that 7 is linked to perfection and linked to God's covenant. And God made a promise that he would destroy the earth first by water and later on by fire. Now, a scientific truth about this. Gofrit, being brimstone or sulfur, can be understood as the fact that gopher wood would be the use of a form of a plant with sulfur-bearing lignin. Now, lignin is a special polymer that plants have that confer its rigidity. That is part of the key structural materials in the support tissues of cells. They lend rigidity and do not rot easily. There are 2 types of lignin, and one of them are the sulfur-bearing lignin. One of them is the sulfur-bearing lignin. This sulfur-bearing lignin is the preference type of wood to make ships, vessels, you name it, all kinds of boats, anything when it enters in contact with the ocean. So there are different types of trees that have this sulfur-bearing lignin. We cannot point out one exactly, but that could be a possible explanation as to why gopher wood is mentioned. And if we look at it from the spiritual perspective, I will show you a verse a little bit further on so we can understand it. But let's continue on to the next material, that is pitch. Now, pitch has an insulating property and it's waterproof once it dries out and is sticked onto a certain surface. So that is why God commanded the ark to be insulated both in the inside and from the outside so that water would not enter the ark. Now, the word used here to cover the ark both inside and outside is kapar. It's a word that we have seen previously in the previous Torah portion. Kapar, it's the same root word for kippur, from Yom Kippur. In other words, kapar, that means to cover, also means to atone. So when the Israelites would make an animal sacrifice, a lamb sacrifice, a bull sacrifice, to atone for or cover the sins of the people, that word used there was kapar. And for us, nowadays, the fact that we all have the opportunity to have redemption, salvation, it's because Yeshua, kapar, for us, he covered our sins. As we see in Revelation 5:9-10, that says, "And they sang a new song saying, Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God." By your blood. Remember, blood is the one that would cover the sins from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have made them kingdom and Kohanim, actually, to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. So this is quite interesting, because what kept Noach and his family safe was the pitch that covered them from the destruction of the whole world. In the same way, for the end times, we are going to be protected by Yeshua HaMashiach because of the covering that he did for our sins from the second destruction of the entire world, but this time by fire. Now, why I also find it interesting, the spiritual side of gopher, wood, is that knowing that this is the root word for gofrit, that is brimstone or sulfur, this was basically telling us in the first destruction of the world that the second destruction was going to be of fire. As we see in Revelation 21:8, it says, "But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death." There you go. Very well. Now, all of you might be thinking, now, how did Noah's Ark look like? If you're picturing this in your mind because perhaps it was in a kid's Bible storytelling or some poster, I'm sorry, but no, because if it would have looked like that, the poor animals would have been completely blown out of the ark with just like the first tidal wave. Anyway, so how did the ark really look like? The description that the Bible gives us a certain picture as to what it looked like, and it also gives us the dimensions. Now, the dimensions were 300 cubits or amma, the length, 50 cubits or amma in Hebrew, the width, 30 cubits or amma, the height, and the window is 1 amma. Now, the window that had to be made, this is something that's kind of controversial when it comes to picturing how the ark looked like, because by the way it is written in the Hebrew, it could be understood as is shown here in this photo, that there was an extra cubit on top where the window would be. But it could also be understood that counting from the roof down 1 cubit, there would be a window. So that is what is not exact. And then depending on what kind of conversion of measurement you use, it could have a different interpretation to what it would be on our standard unit of length. For example, in this case, in the Old Egyptian or Babylonian cubit, that would be 20.5 inches. You can have 515 feet, the length, the width 86, and the height 51. But for example, if you look at the complete Jewish Bible, they converted it to 450, 75, and 45 respectively. So it depends. The exact measurements, we don't have it, but at least that is a close approximate, and also a close approximate as to what it looked like. And it was to be built with a door on its side, we don't know which, and 3 inward decks. Now, who was to go in? We see in verses 17, that would be 6:17 through 7:3, we see Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, 2 of every kind of unclean animal, and 7 pairs of every clean animal. Now, this is something quite interesting, and it shows how obedient Noah was to the Lord. Because as we see here in Hebrews 11:7, that says, "By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith." Now, this is important because as it says right here, the events that were about to happen were unseen. Of course, it had never happened ever, not even rain. So to build an ark that is far from the ocean and to fill it up with animals is actually, if you, for example, would not taking account the people that live there, they would have thought Noah was crazy. So many times, like nowadays, of course, nowadays we don't have to build an ark and fill it with animals, but sometimes when it comes to the fulfilling of the Torah or obeying the Torah, there are many things that people might think of us as crazy. For instance, by keeping the Feast of Sukkot, you need to abide in booths. And if you construct a booth out of Israel, because in Israel, of course, it is quite normal to see it, but if you build a booth out of Israel, some people might even laugh at you or wonder as to what happened with this person. Has he gone crazy or something? So this is something important, because sometimes out of embarrassment or by the fact that, oh, but what are people going to think of me? People, children of God, do not obey the Lord or don't want to obey the Lord or are ashamed of obeying the Lord, which should not be so, because here it says, in reverent fear constructed an ark. In the same way, we, in reverent fear, ought to obey the Lord in everything, because in the end, the only opinion that should matter to us is the opinion of the Almighty Elohim. But we shouldn't care a thing about what other people think about us or say about us, because in the end, they're not the ones that are going to save us. God is. So let's continue. Now, it's also mentioned clean animals and unclean animals. This is quite interesting, because the definition of clean and unclean animals, we see it in Leviticus chapter 11, that are animals that can be eaten and animals that can't be eaten and whose dead carcasses cannot be touched. Now, this gives us an interesting view and a great revelation as to the fact that Torah existed before Sinai. This is important, because how else would you know clean and unclean animals? So this is important. Let's continue. Now, this is something quite interesting. When we talk about, let's look really quick at our Haftarah in Yeshayahu, Isaiah 55 from 1 through 5. We are talking right now about waters of destruction. But God had a plan also of waters of life. Let's look at Yeshayahu 55, 1 through 5. It says, all you who are thirsty, come to the water. You without money, come, buy and eat. Yes, come. Buy wine and milk without money. It's free. Why spend money for what isn't food? Your wages for what doesn't satisfy? Listen carefully to me, and you will eat well. You will enjoy the fat of the land. Open your ears and come to me. Listen well, and you will live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, the grace I assured David. I have given him as a witness to the peoples, a leader and lawgiver for the peoples. You will summon a nation you do not know, and a nation that doesn't know you will run to you, for the sake of Adonai your God, the Holy One of Israel, who will glorify you. Now, does this sound familiar, or what is it talking about? The coming of Yeshua. Let's look at John 7:37. It says, on the last and greatest day of the festival, being Sukkot, Yeshua stood and said in a loud voice, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. So we see also in John 4:13 through 14, it says, Yeshua said, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. So, of course, the first water that came destroyed the whole world to bring a renewal. In the same way, the water that Yeshua offers mankind is to bring life into that person, to give them everlasting life. But in order to have that everlasting life, one needs to die in their old self. And we see that through the cleansing that we have through water. And we see it in 1 Kepha 3:18 through 22, 1 Peter 3:18 through 22, that says, for the Messiah himself died for sins once and for all, a righteous person on behalf of unrighteous people, so that he might bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but brought to life by the Spirit. And in this form, he went and made a proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago in the days of Noach, when God waited patiently during the building of the ark, in which a few people, to be specific, 8, were delivered by means of water. This also prefigures what delivers us now, the water of immersion, the baptism, which is not the removal of dirt from the body, but one's pledge to keep a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Yeshua the Messiah. He has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers subject to him. So we ought to die in our former lives as well, so that when we come out of the waters of immersion, we come out as people that are renewed by Mashiach Yeshua. And for that, we have to pledge to keep a good conscience toward God. Now, here comes the tough stuff. This is an important date, the 17th day of the second month of the 600th year of Noah's life. The fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of the sky were opened, and thus began the flood. And we see in verse 16 that the Lord shuts the door of the ark in order to preserve Noach and his household. Now, if we look about opening and closing doors, we see here in John 10:9 that Yeshua says, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture." So this is important because there is only one door, and that is Yeshua. And also, Yeshua is the only one who can open the door for those who he sets apart to enter. But also, if you disobey and are against Yeshua, it is a door that will close and cannot be opened. As says in Revelation 3:8, "I know your deeds. Behold, I have put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have a little power, and have kept my word and have not denied my name." So again, only the Lord can shut and open doors which no one can open or shut. So therefore, we ought to know, will we have an open door or a closed door? This depends on your relationship that you have with the Lord. So each one personally knows the answer. In verse 20, we see that the waters increased until reaching 22.5 feet above the mountain tops. So add that to the Everest, and you can have an approximate idea as to how high the waters of the flood reached. And of course, verse 22, we see that everything died. Now, the verses following this verse talks about different dates and days concerning the whole period of the flood. So let's look at it because it mentions certain months. Now, it's not the months that we have in the Greco-Roman calendar, in other words, from January to December. No, that calendar was created about 4,000 millennia afterwards, more or less, but basically less. Anyway, we need to look at God's calendar. Therefore, we need to look at the Hebrew months, being the first Nisan and the last Adar. So we have Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevat, Shevat, and Adar. Each one having different numbers of days in the month, 3029, 3029, 3029, 3029, 3029. And we can also see that kind of where they are located in the calendar that the world uses nowadays. For example, Nisan is March, April, Cheshvan is October, November. So just so you guys can have an idea. And of course, the feast days where they're located, Passover in Nisan, Shavuot in Sivan, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. That's not a feast day, actually. This is an important biblical historical day concerning the the 2 times destruction of the temple in Av. We have Yom Teruah, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Tishrei, and Hanukkah in Kislev. But anyway, so here we have the 12-month cycle in the Hebrew calendar. So it says that the flood starts in the 17th day of the 2nd month of the 600th year of Noach's life. So here we have the month of Iyar, okay? Then it says that the water has power, well, had better said, power over the earth for 150 days. So then we see that water that had power over the earth 150 days takes us all the way down to the 7th month, that would be Tishrei. And we see that in Tishrei, on the 17th day of the 17th month, in other words, exactly 5 months afterwards, the ark rests on Mount Ararat. That's in verse 4. And a few months later, on the 10th month, we see that on the 1st day of the 10th month, the top of mountains are seen. And then it says that from verse 6 through 12, after 40 days, Noach opened the window. So if we count 40 days from the 1st of Tevat, being the 10th month, it takes us to the 11th of Shevat, the 11th month. So that is when Noach opens the window and sends out first the raven and then the dove. Then it says that 7 days later, Noach sends the dove, so that would be the 18th of Shevat, and the dove brings back an olive leaf. 7 days later, after that, that would be the 25th of Shevat, being the 11th month, the dove does not return. So that would be up until before the 12th month. Then we see the 12th month, nothing happens. And then it says on verse 13, the first day of the 1st month of the 601st year of Noach was when water dried up from the earth and Noach removes the covering. So that would be the 1st of Nisan. And then we see that the earth is completely dry, as says in verse 14, the 27th of the 2nd month, the month of Iyar. So the total time in the ark that Noach and his household spent with all the animals was 1 year and 10 days. That will be the total time. But this is so you can see kind of where things happen. So also a parallel to our nowadays calendar that we use that is not the biblical one, just to make a little emphasis on that. And as we mentioned in the previous Torah portion, this is the cycle that was created in day 4. This is the calendar that was instituted by the Lord. Good. Then we, just to take a little look on the dove and the raven. The raven was the first one to be sent, and of course we see that it does not return. But what do we know about the raven? First of all, it's an unclean animal, as said in Leviticus 11:15. We see in Luke 12:24 that it is cared for by God. So it is highly probable that the fact why it didn't return is because it was provided for. And then we see in 1 Kings 17 from 4 to 6 that ravens were used to feed Elijah. So they are used as tools in some way, or messengers, not messengers, but mostly tools, or they obey God, better said. And according to the dove is a clean animal. In Jeremiah 8:7, we see that it is linked to obedience. It represents obedience. And in Mark 1:10, the dove appears after Yeshua's immersion as a symbolic form of the Holy Spirit. So this is quite interesting because, as we have just mentioned previously, That water immersion represents, of course, how a person dies to his old self and comes out of the water. And it shows how it is a parallel to the flood making a cleansing of the whole world and having a new start. And of course, Yeshua gave us the example of he himself being immersed in water. And when he comes out of the water, the dove descends. The Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, descends as a dove. And it's quite interesting that once the flood is over, once the cleansing of the world is over, that the animal that brought the hope that the world was once again renewed was indeed the dove that brought the olive leaf. Now, another interesting thing that I did not add, but it's better this way because I'd like you to read the whole chapter, is that this olive leaf also has a very important representation, because the dove could have brought any other branch or leaf or flower, you name it. It could have brought anything, but it brings an olive leaf, and it's not just something spontaneous or something that doesn't have any sense, but actually it does. And the olive tree itself represents Israel. If you read Romans 11, it gives you the definition of Israel. But a little spoiler, Israel is, of course, the original people of Israel that God called for himself in the Torah, but also those who were engrafted into by Mashiach Yeshua, means the Gentiles that were from the wild olive trees that were engrafted into the original olive tree. So this is quite interesting because it shows that after the cleansing of the world comes the hope, and the hope is the olive tree. So in the same way, when Mashiach Yeshua ascends, and of course Paul starts his ministry, it talks about the olive tree. So this shows that the hope for the end times is, of course, one being engrafted into the olive tree. In other words, one having that promise or that hope that one is going to be part of God's people and live and survive the second destruction. Therefore, make sure you are engrafted into the olive tree. And if you are going to be engrafted into the olive tree, you need to be under God's covenant. And to be under God's covenant, you need to follow the terms of the covenant. And the terms of the covenant is Torah. Very well. Then we see on verse 15 through 19, God orders Noach to come out of the ark along with everything inside, all the animals. And God wanted and wants all living creatures to be fruitful and multiply. Again, this is like a second creation. They had to repopulate the earth. And we see then from verses 20 through 22 of chapter 8 and chapter 9, verses 8 through 16, God establishes a covenant with human or mankind. Now, this is with all living things. That means animals and humans. First of all, no longer was he to curse the ground on account of humankind. In other words, the ground will not be cursed any longer on our account. And no longer was he to destroy everything with a flood. Now, what was the sign of this covenant? It was the rainbow. Now, the rainbow has officially 7 colors. There's the reference right below. 7 colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. You probably learned this in school. 7 colors. And as I mentioned before, 7 being the number of perfection and also the number linked to God's covenant or God's promises. So this is important. 7 colors. In other words, the bow that he set in the sky, that he was to remember each time he would look at it when it rains, it has the number 7. In other words, it represents God's covenant with the people. Sheva equals covenant. Now, this is something important because mankind, once again, tampering with things that belong to the Lord. The LGBTQ and I don't know what other letters in the alphabet uses the a rainbow themed flag. But this rainbow themed flag only has 6 colors. And we know that 6 is the number of rebellion, the number of mankind, or even the number of the enemy. We see that when it is used by the Antichrist as 666. So the fact that this group of people, the fact that they use this representation of the rainbow in such a horrible way is actually a blasphemy against the Lord, which is wrong. The rainbow does not belong to them. It belongs to God, and it has 7 colors. And how long is this to last? As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. So God also, well, this is an eternal covenant that he established with all the world. And he also was to make endure seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, winter, in other words, seasons, day and night. Very well. Now, what was man's part of this covenant? They had to be fruitful and multiply. Again, God is against contraception. They were to have everything as food now. We see that later on, if you are part of God's people, that changes because you need to follow what is according what God instituted in Leviticus 11. And something that goes for all mankind is do not eat the blood. It is life. That is verse 4. Now, what's interesting is that the word here, life, is not actually the word chaim, that is life in Hebrew, but actually the word that is used here is nefesh, that is wrongly translated as soul. The nefesh is the living part of us. It's God's life breath. It's our wholeness, or who we are, our living selves. Because the Greek concept of soul that we use, that we shouldn't, but is used nowadays by many Christians, is like some sort of vapor or some sort of spirit, but that is contained in a physical body. But that is not what is mentioned here in the Hebrew text, but is actually oneself, that this body lives because God breathed the life into it. So it is ourselves, who we are, our living selves. So we see that blood contains and is the nefesh. Blood sustains the nefesh also, and the nefesh is our whole selves. Now, if we look at the biological side of blood, we know that if a certain part of the body would have a cease of blood flow, that part of the body immediately starts to die. Okay, that is why when a person is declared dead, the person has no more. There are many things to declare a person dead. There are many criteria, but one of them is, of course, the cease of blood flow, the ceasing of blood flow. That means the heart no longer pumps. And of course, that means that no blood, no life. And if we look at this in the spiritual perspective, if God is not our life source, then we are spiritually dead. But if God is our life source, then we are truly alive. And this also helps us understand verses 5 and 6 that says, I will certainly demand an accounting for the blood of your lives. I will demand it from every animal and from every human being. I will demand from every human being an accounting for the life of his fellow human being. Whoever sheds human blood by a human being, his own blood be shed, for God made human beings in his image. So we portray the image of the Lord, therefore, and also the Lord determines how long a person is to live. Sometimes we live up to 120, sometimes we live less. It also depends on how we take care of our bodies. But we cannot decide who is to live and who is not, and that's why we can't decide upon ourselves as well. We cannot decide if we are to continue living or not. This is also important because the bloodshed, you are basically going against that life source that God has given us. You are destroying the image that God created in creation. So this is very important. Now, going on to verses 20 through 23, we see that Noach is the first person to plant a vineyard and also is the first person after the flood, I presume, to get drunk. And he lays exposed in his tent after getting drunk. Now, this is important because it says that Ham, that is one of Noach's sons, looks upon his father's nakedness. Now, this is important because here the Bible teaches us a very important concept that we must keep in consideration and we must obey in each household that follows and serves the Lord, is that a son and daughter must respect a parent's privacy and must not see them naked. Okay? Because one's nakedness is reserved for oneself, or in the unity of matrimony, because when man and woman get married, they become one. So that's why only a man is to look upon the nakedness of his wife, and the wife to look upon the nakedness of her spouse, of her husband. But children are not to look upon the nakedness of their parents, for it does not correspond to them, and they cannot break the privacy that they have. Now, this is very important because also, if we see later on in Leviticus 18 concerning the importance of preserving or protecting or keeping private one's nakedness, we see that in Leviticus 18, to uncover the nakedness of a person, going deeper into a deeper term, because one thing is to see the nakedness of a person, the other thing is to uncover the nakedness of the person. Here it implies that to uncover the nakedness of a person is to sleep with that person, in other words, to have sexual relations. But that is not mentioned here in the text. Here in the text, it mentions, it does not mention that Ham uncovered the nakedness. It just mentions that he saw the nakedness of his father. We then later see the conduct portrayed by his two brothers that was the correct conduct, that they walk into their father's tent, but walking backwards with coverings held toward the back of them in order to cover their father, and then they would walk out without looking back. So that was to protect, of course, the nakedness of the father. Then we see that Ham gets cursed afterward, and we'll see that curse in just a moment. But why was it wrong for him to see his father's nakedness? Why can't a child look upon the nakedness of a parent? Well, the answer is simple, and the Bible answers that. It's because sin enters through the eyes. We are people that have a sinful nature that we are working very hard and striving to destroy, that we can only achieve through Yeshua HaMashiach. But sin enters through the eyes, and we see that since Genesis 3:6, when we saw how Chava, Eve, saw the tree and looked at its beautiful fruit and therefore brought disobedience into the world. And that's why we are here today with sin. And then we see, of course, in Matthew 5:27-30, that Yeshua, when he talks about adultery, he says, if one looks at a woman, if a man looks at a woman and desires her, so even the fact of looking at a woman to desire her, or that leads to desiring her, is accounted for as adultery. So that is why one needs to be careful with what one sees, because this also applies to other parts many times, and many people make the mistake in this area and have been guilty by it, but through Yeshua HaMashiach you can free yourself from it, is that many people see movies or TV shows and even read books that have immoral sexual content, sometimes sex scenes or naked people, or the verbalization or the written form of it, when it comes to books. So this is something that one ought to be very careful, because you are allowing that to enter through your eyes, and the eyes are the doors of your soul. And of course, the concept that one ought to have of the sexual relationship that one has as man and woman, as husband and wife, is one to be thought of or to be seen as what God had intended since the beginning. Because don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that sex is a sin, but it has to be in the way Torah mentions it, or in the way God has intended it to be. But the world will corrupt anything that God makes good. So that is why when someone sees, looks at, watches things that are incorrect, that is the information that you are going to be storing in your brain. And if you store that in your brain, those are the actions that you're going to carry out later on, and then you will be sinning against the Lord with your mind and with your flesh, with your body. Very well. So continuing on with this, sin enters through the eyes. We see that Ham is cursed by being a servant of servants to his brothers. Now, where did Ham's children populate? They populated some parts of Southwest Asia, Canaan, and Africa. Now, and we know that Canaan later on in story, or we will see later on in the Bible story, that Canaan got completely destroyed. But as to Africa, we know by history and by what we have learned, and please don't get me wrong, but this is historical truth. Africa had in the future was going to suffer through an immense tragedy of something called slavery. Slavery has been going on through many years. There are still some human slaves. Of course, it's not as horrible as it was before. There are still some that are hidden, but we know that the vast majority of slaves came from the African region, from the African continent. Now, with this, I'm not saying that I am in favor of slavery. No, because slavery is awful, and the Lord hates slavery. He does not like it, and slavery is just such a very sad and tragic thing that honestly I wish never happened in history. But we can see how through the incorrect and shameful and sinful action of one person, how this person later on condemned thousands and thousands of people in history. And well, praise the Lord that nowadays that state of slavery is no longer, but we have now more free people. But we, as in a general way, the whole world is still a slave of sin, but that is because of our own actions. That, praise the Lord, through Yeshua HaMashiach, we can break those chains. So after the flood, Noach lived 350 years, being a total of 950. Chapter 10, we go on to the genealogy of Shem, Ham, and Yafet. The genealogy of Yefet, being his sons Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Javan, of course, his offspring being the Maritime people, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and the Rodanim, and Gomer having Ashkenaz, Rephas, and Togarmah. And as I showed you in this previous map, the sons of Japheth, or Yefet, that would be the correct word, populated what we know today as Europe and parts of Asia. But Asia, we're talking about the East-North Asia. And then Ham, we see that he had 4 sons, Cush, Mitzraim, Put, and Canaan. Now, Mitzraim is the same word for Egypt. If we look at all the places in the Bible where it says Egypt, if you look at the Hebrew text, it's Mitzraim. So, and from Mitzraim came the Ludites, the Anamites, the Naphtuhites, the Pathrusites, the Lehabites, the Cashluites. From the Cashluites, we have the Philistines that we know later on are going to give Israel a very hard time, and the Caphtorites that inhabited the island of Crete. And then from Canaan, we have Sidon, the Girgashites, Hittites, Sinites, Jebusites, Arvadites, Amorites, Zemarites, Hivites, Hamathites, and Archites, all the land of Canaan. That's why it was called Canaan. And from Cush, we have Nimrod, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka. And from Rama, we have Sheba and Dan. And now we're going to make a little parenthesis and talk about this horrible person right here called Nimrod. That is Ham's dreadful grandson. Now, who was Nimrod? Nimrod, the Bible mentions that it's the first powerful ruler on earth. And we see that it was a mighty hunter. Our Bibles say before the Lord, but if we translate it exactly that word, it would be in the face of Adonai. And it says that his kingdom began with Babel, or Bavel, better said, Bavel. And if we look at all the places in the Bible where it's mentioned Babylon, it's not Babylon, it's actually Bavel. Erech, Akkad, Kalne, Shinar, Nineveh, Rehovot, Kelach, and Resen. Okay? So basically, he was the one that began the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. And we know that both took Israel to captivity. And we see that Babylon plays an important role throughout history in the sense that Babylon is seen in a spiritual warfare with God and with his people. We see that, for example, here in Revelation 18, from 1 through 8, it says, "After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority. The earth was lit up by his splendor. He cried out in a strong voice, 'She has fallen, Bavel the Great. She has become a home for demons, a prison for every unclean spirit, a prison for every unclean, hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of God's fury caused by her whoring. Yes, the kings of the earth went whoring with her, and with her unrestrained love of luxury, the world's businessmen have grown rich.' Then I heard another voice out of heaven saying, 'My people, come out of her so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not be infected by her plagues. For her sins are a sticky mass piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Render to her as she rendered to others. Pay her back double for what she has done. Use the cup in which she has brewed to brew her a double-sized drink. Give her as much torment and sorrow as the glory and luxury she gave herself. For in her heart she says, I sit a queen, I am not a widow, I will never see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in a single day, death, sorrow, and famine, and she will be burned with fire because Adonai, God, her judge, is mighty.'" So here we see that Babylon basically is a nation of abhorrent sin, a nation that is a sexual, spiritually sexual whore. In other words, spiritual sexual immorality. that made the nations spiritually immoral. In other words, that this nation or this empire or this kingdom of Babylon has had such a strong sinful influence upon every nation up until now. So you can see, and this was the beginning of the kingdom of Nimrod. We can also see that it has its link to the beast in Revelation 13 from 1 to 3. It says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth." In other words, where's the mouth? In the head, a lion's head. This is important. Keep that in mind, head. "And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority." The dragon being nasty, you know who, the enemy. "One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast." Then we have the parallel in Daniel 7 from 2 to 4. "Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the earth strove upon the great sea, and 4 beasts came up from the sea." Again, beasts coming up from the sea, "diverse one from another." When we see the books of Daniel and Revelation, we'll look into these visions through more detail, a more detailed revision of this. But as we can see, the first kingdom that is linked to Babylon is also what? A lion. That is why the beast in Revelation has the characteristics of the beast in Daniel. We know that the beast in Daniel 7 are different periods of time, being the Babylonian, the Middle Persian, the Greeks, and later on the Roman and end time kingdoms. But Revelation, the beast, the first beast, is like a combination, or like all the strengths of these kingdoms combined or formed up into one. But the head being of a lion, and the lion with the wings being Babylon, we also see in Nebuchadnezzar's dream that there was the head of gold, again, head, that was Babylon. Okay, so again, when we see the letter Resh in the Hebrew alphabet being the head is always linked to first. That's why, for example, when we talk about the first day of the month, we say Rosh Chodesh, that means the head of the month. Or when we talk about the first day of the year, we say Rosh Hashanah, that is the head of the year. So again, Nimrod's kingdom began, that means the head or the first of his kingdom was Bavel, Babylon. And of course, this was the beginning of the spiritual warfare against the Lord with this horrible kingdom. And we see how this later on is going to play a huge part in the end times, with the beast that is going to come to once again have this last stand up against the Lord, and we know that the Lord is going to defeat him. Okay, but we'll see that in more detail later on. Let's continue on. Now, Nimrod in history is known as the first person to deify himself. That means to make himself be considered a god, adopting different names throughout history, because he was not only a god to his people in that moment, but they continued on his deity legacy, if you could call it like that, throughout different cultures and different regions throughout the world. For example, the Israelites, how did they commit spiritual adultery? They committed spiritual adultery with Baal. And Baal was another name for Nimrod. We see his son, later on Tammuz also, and his hateful wife, the Ashtoreth, that was known as the Queen of Heaven. Now, I don't know if that sounds familiar to you, but it does to me. for many things. In the Phoenicians, it was El, Bacchus, and Astarte. For Babylonians, it was Belus, Tammuz, and Ishtar. For the Assyrians, it's Ninus, Hercules, and Beltis. For the Greeks, Zeus, Dionysus, and Aphrodite. For Rome, Jupiter, Attis, and Diana. For Egypt, Ra, Osiris, or Horus, and Isis, or Hathor. For India, we have the Vishnu, the Krishna, and Isi. For the Chinese people, or China, the Pangu Yi, or Heng-O. For Mexico, Teotl, Quetzalcoatl, and Coatlicue. And for the Scandinavians, we have Odin, Balder, or some consider Thor, and Frigg or Freda. So as you guys can see, these throughout the whole, this character, this Nimrod, has adopted different names throughout history. But as you guys can see there, he adopted the title of Lord of Heaven. His son, Tammuz, like as he were a deliverer, and Semiramis, that was his wife, the Queen of Heaven. Now, I'm going to make another more detailed video concerning these horrible characters and how they have made Christians fall into sin through different practices that probably you didn't know of. But for example, they are also portrayed in Catholicism, because we know that Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church, has the name Roman in it, has a strong influence from the Roman Empire. The Romans having Jupiter, Attis, some consider Cupid, and Diana. And we see that in the statues or the carvings that they make, we see that they make a similar statue to that of Jupiter for either God or Saint Peter. We see that they call Mary, that is not actually Mary, it's Yeshua's mother Miriam, and we know that Yeshua's mother Miriam was only his mother while she was alive and is now dead. She is not an intercessor. That is Yeshua's job. But we see that she is called as the Queen of Heaven. So, and of course, they have the baby Jesus, that is not Yeshua. So we see how that it has infiltrated itself into certain religions. This triad right here. Anyway. So continuing on, one of his kingdoms was also Akkad, the Acadian Empire. Now the Acadian Empire, according to history, you can see in the Britannica Encyclopedia, was a northern division of Babylonia. And we find that one of its main rulers was Naram-Sin. That is one of another name for Nimrod. And I'll show you. It says, meaning beloved of the moon god Sin, was a ruler of the Acadian Empire who reigned from 2254 till 2218 BC, and was the third successor and grandson of King Sargon of Akkad. Under Naram-Sin, the empire reached its maximum strength. He was the first Mesopotamian king to have claimed divinity for himself. Again, first Mesopotamian king to have claimed divinity for himself, taking the title God of Akkad, and the first to claim the title King of the Four Quarters, King of the Universe. So again, he was trying to imitate our Elohim. He was going against our Elohim. Another of his cities was Erech, also known to our history as Uruk, that is the southern division of Babylonia. And we see that one of the main constructions or representative figures of the Uruk Empire was the Anu Ziggurat. The Anu Ziggurat was dedicated to the sky god Anu. And who's the sky god? Who called himself the sky god? Nimrod. So Anu is another name for Nimrod. Then we see Nineveh, that also plays an important part in the biblical history. You'll see later on, we have Calne, we have Rezin, that we don't know exactly where they are, but they are also in the same area. Now, the question is, how did Bavel start? Well, it started with rebellion and defiance in the face of God, remember. How? They said to one another, remember that Elohim had told mankind in Genesis 9:1 to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. That means to go throughout the whole world. But they said to one another, come, let's make bricks and bake them in fire. So they had bricks for building stone and clay for mortar. Then they said, come, let's build ourselves a city with a tower that has its top reaching up into heaven, again, trying to take the position that does not correspond to mankind of trying to be God. They can't. So that we can make a name for ourselves and not be scattered all over the earth. Again, rebellion, going against what God had ordered. So Nimrod, as we can see, the beginning of his empire was to go against everything that God had told mankind to do, trying to portray himself as if he were God. And the Bible says that everyone spoke the same language. Now, I want you guys to see something that is terrifying. Look at this image of the representation of what people think the Tower of Bavel looked like. Now look at the seal of the European Union. It has the unfinished construction of the Tower of Babel, and it has inverted 5-pointed stars that have the shape of the head of the goat that we know that Hasatan uses to of course his satanic religion. So imagine and look at the phrase that they use in this seal in the Council of Europe. It says many tongues, one voice. And now the main building of the European Union resembles an unfinished construction, again resembling the Tower of Bavel. So as we can see, Bavel is repeating itself. Again, that same spirit of rebellion and defiance against the Lord that Nimrod had is still in our society, our present day society. We see this in Europe. We can see this in the United States. We can see this in any other country of the world. This is horrible because this means that mankind is constantly trying to define themselves, trying to take that position that does not belong to them but belongs to our Elohim. And we see that God's response from verses 5 through 9 is, he says, come, let us go down and confuse their speech. It says, let us. Okay, just dropping that there. Anyway, so nothing can stop what God plans. So he confuses their speech. Now, as to how the Tower of Bavel looked like, I'm not sure. For example, in this painting, it resembles ziggurats that was part of the Mesopotamian, part of Mesopotamian cultures, and this is more of a European style. So I'm not sure exactly as to what this type of construction, as to the accuracy of the construction. And I'm not sure of this one either, but this does resemble a Mesopotamian ziggurat. Anyway, continuing on. So God confuses the speech of each person that was building the Tower of Bavel. So here we see that God continues his work of creation, but of course, it was intended that only one language be spoken, the Hebrew language. But God, because of mankind, created, and I'm not saying this is bad, because God created it. God created other languages. So these languages becoming the mother tongues or the primal languages from our modern day languages, because of course from these main languages, throughout history has derived many other languages that have been adapting and transforming and altering themselves until the languages that we have today. For example, our English language, Spanish, Italian, French, Chinese, Japanese, you name it. But of course, none of these languages were the ones intended from the beginning, but still, since God created them, they have their beauty. So now the great question is, again, we have just seen how the world was destroyed by waters because of evil, and we see how once again mankind cannot help themselves and be evil again, and we see how they are constantly defying the Lord. So again, you might think to yourselves, oh no, we've lost all hope. No, there's always a backup plan. God always has a plan. So now we're going to see the genealogy of Shem. We see that Shem had Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. Arphaxad had Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and Terah had Nahor, Abraham, but of course Avraham, but his first name was Avram, and Haran. And of course, we'll see that don't pay attention to the following generations because we'll see them in the future. Joktan had Almodad, Shelev, Hazar, Mavet, Jerah, Hadaram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havila, Jobab, and Aram had Uz, Hul, Gether, and Meshech. Anyway, so from the line of Shem, that of course we see that when Noach curses Ham, he also blesses his other two sons, but putting Shem as the head of his three sons. And from Shem comes a new character into the picture, into our story, that is Avram. Avram being the son of Terah from a Semite. And from Avram is going to portray another immense and beautiful story. And we're going to see how God brings about his plan of salvation bit by bit. We're working through. So with this, we have concluded our Parashah Noach, and we are going to see Avram's story in the following Torah portions. So, Toda Rabba, thank you very much. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May you have a beautiful week. Lehitarot.